I want to talk a little bit about the messianic stuff in the early parts of Isaiah.
Mm-hmm.
This is stuff we're familiar with from Christmas time. It's on plaques. I've seen plaques in people's homes who mighty God, warrior and all this kind of stuff. And I think if we can, and I think we're on the same page on this, so this should work. If we could just help contextualize both historically what is happening in this book of Emmanuel in its historical context, and then we can also have a conversation about how it gets taken up in the New Testament and how we theologically hold those two things together.
One of our best known passages from the Old Testament is, you'll bear a son and you'll call his name Emmanuel. And so in the situation of the day, Isaiah has gone to King Ahaz of the house of David, the Davidic royal line, and the king in chapter 7 of Isaiah, he is terrified and struggling with the impending attack of two of his northern neighbors, the northern kingdom Israel, in alliance with the Syrians, not the Assyrians, but the Syrians. And Isaiah brings a word of encouragement to him that that God has the intention to deliver. And that's where in that context he says, ask for whatever sign of assurance. And then as you did the parody, in this pious way, not,
he's already made the foreign treaty and everything.
He has already made a treaty with the Assyrians.
I won't test the Lord. I would never deign to test the Lord.
So through the prophet Isaiah, God says, okay, well, I'm going to give you a sign whether you want it or not. And this is it. And then the maiden, it's usually translated virgin because there's some ambiguity in the meaning, semantic ambiguity.
Just so for our listeners, the Hebrew is Alma, and that's taken up in the Greek as Parthenos. And the Greek translator of Isaiah, using Parthenos is a perfectly appropriate term. It does have the sense of virgin, but it also has just the sense of maiden as well. Most maidens were virgins, so that's that kind of that overlap. So the translator didn't think he was changing the meaning, in other words, by going to Greek. We'll talk about Matthew in a second, but Matthew, obviously, in the incarnation and the virgin birth, that kind of brings this to a new place of now it is really virgin, right? So okay, keep going.
So we have this prophecy given, and we usually think, okay, well, that's talking about Jesus and end of story, and then we jump to the Gospel of Matthew. Well, the difficulty with thinking about the text that way, and I hope your listeners think carefully with me about this. The prophecy that Isaiah gave of the sign, it had to have some significance and meaning that was relevant in the context of Isaiah and the king Ahaz to whom he was giving the sign.
Right.
Because in fact, if you go on and read the context, it talks about, well, the son's going to be born, and by the time he reaches the age of accountability, your enemies are going to be destroyed.
Right.
So whoever this son is that's going to be born has to be born within short order, within a couple of years of the prophecy, and therefore the woman, the text is very clear in Hebrew. It's the maiden or the virgin. There was someone very specific in the mind of Isaiah and in the mind of Ahaz that they both knew who they were talking about. We're not told who this woman is, but they know who they're talking about. Now, is it the wife of the prophet? Because in chapter 8, the prophetess conceives, and we don't need to go into the theories of the possible identity. Maybe some think it's Hezekiah, the son that's addressed later in the book. But anyway, there's difficulties in knowing exactly who, but that's not important to understand the message of the text, which is that God is promising someone of the royal house who will be a deliverer.
Yes,
and therefore we've got to have something relevant to the immediate context of Isaiah and Ahaz, circa 725, whatever, BC. And we also need a message that has enough wobble room in the meaning of the words that for a later audience who now has much more understanding of salvation history and see how this language has a more developed meaning to a later generation, referring to Mary, who is virgin.
Yeah, actually a virgin, right?
At the time of conception, and her son, who is Emmanuel, Jesus.
Yeah.
I don't know if you wanted me to go any further, or if you want.
No, that's good. Yeah. I mean, I think just to help underscore for our listeners. So what John's saying, right, is this message would have no significance for the immediate context, and therefore it would be completely irrelevant to the king if the underlying subtext was in 700 years from now, someone's going to be born. I don't think any of us would, if we were hearing a word of consolation from God, about I'm going to deliver you a word of consolation for your immediate context. In 700 years from now, something really amazing is going to happen, right? Like the prophets are always talking about future events within their lifetime or the lifetime of the next generation. That's not unique to Israel prophecy. That's the nature of all ancient Near Eastern prophecy. That's kind of how it works. People didn't just randomly sit back and speculate kind of Nostradamus style on what's going to happen, thousands of years later. That just wasn't a thing. So when we think about how we put these two together, we can see that what's happening in the New Testament is really drawing out greater significance or a fuller meaning, if you like. The way the church has typically done it is they use the Latin term, the sensus plenior, or a fuller sense. Different people, depending on their comfort level or their style of interpretation, might use different terms. If they're dependent on like Hirsch, they might distinguish between meaning and significance. But the idea is there's some greater sense that's being drawn out here. And that God's not doing this by accident, right? The initial event has that full, had the virgin birth in its purview from God's perspective. And it's only in retrospect that we see that on our end as human beings, but it's all spirit-inspired text. And so there's a great correspondence between, in Jesus's day, you have another wicked king. In fact, Matthew kind of portrays him as a pharaoh, and Jesus is like a new Moses type figure that has to be delivered from this pharaoh who wants to kill him. But in the same way that Isaiah text is brought in, it kind of reminds people of the story of being under the people in Judea being under the thumb of wicked kings and suffering because of that in some ways. And so Jesus is now this greater sign through the Virgin that God is now finally bringing that ultimate Davidic king that we've been waiting for, that's going to liberate the people. So I think it's more than just, oh, Mary's a virgin. Like, I think there's deeper correspondence in the story that Matthew's drawing out in all of these fulfillment texts that he points to.
The analogy that I like to use that your listeners might find helpful is Looney Tunes.
Oh yeah,
cartoons. You've heard me use this illustration, Max. But when you're watching, Roadrunner and Wile E. Coyote, and the kids are watching the cartoon, they're on the floor rolling in laughter. The parents are sitting on the couch behind them, also laughing. But they're laughing at different things. Yeah. Now, why is that? Well, the script writers are aware of two horizons of audiences. There's the children and there's the adults. And so they craft a script that has meaning and significance that the kids can relate to. And then there's another layer, a different horizon of interpretation that has new significance and fuller meaning for the adults who are watching, who can read between the lines and pick up, the subtle allusions. But when I was a kid, I liked Rocky and Bullwinkle, and I laughed at what happened to Boris and Natasha. Only later in life did I come to learn that Boris and Natasha are the KGB.
Yeah.
And also there were undertones of Nazi identity in the bad guy and the fearless leader. Well, the same script writers are there, and they're writing with the intention to address both levels of meaning. And I think that's analogous to the Holy Spirit, who's giving two levels of meaning for the audience, so that the later audience with more maturity and more understanding of the unfolding salvation history of God, they see broader significance in the language that was originally used.
Yeah. And in your analogy, the only thing that distinguishes the children from the adults is the adults just have a more privileged perspective in terms of what God is revealed, right? It's not that they're better as adults. It's simply we're at this point in God's revelation of himself.